Russia has reportedly moved nuclear munitions into Belarus during major nuclear military drills. Moscow and Minsk even released video footage showing military vehicles entering a forest area while missiles were loaded onto launch systems. The drills involve the Iskander-M missile system, a powerful mobile weapon that can carry both conventional and nuclear warheads up to 500 kilometers away.
August 1st, 2025. Friday afternoon. Donald Trump gets on Truth Social and publishes a statement that no sitting president has ever published in quite this way before. He announces publicly that he has ordered 2 American nuclear submarines to reposition. Not a vague reference to increased military readiness. Not a classified briefing to allies behind closed doors. A social media post. On Truth Social. Telling the world that nuclear submarines are moving because of something a Russian official said online. The post read, "I have ordered 2 nuclear submarines to be positioned in the appropriate regions, just in case these foolish and inflammatory statements are more than just that." Let that sentence sit for a moment. Just in case. A US president repositioning nuclear weapons. Just in case. Because of a social media argument with Dmitry Medvedev. And within 72 hours of that post, the Kremlin responded. Putin's spokesperson Dmitry Peskov stood before reporters and delivered a message directed squarely at the President of the United States. 4 words. Be very, very careful. I've been going through the full timeline of this nuclear standoff, the exchange that triggered it, the chain of events that built to it, and the broader structural collapse happening underneath it that most coverage is completely missing. Because the submarine movement is one headline. What's underneath it is a story about a nuclear arms control architecture that took 50 years to build, and that just expired without a legally binding replacement. For the first time since the early 1970s, the United States and Russia have no treaty limiting their nuclear weapons. None. Zero. And this submarine confrontation happened inside that vacuum. Let me show you exactly how we got here. Start with Medvedev. Because understanding who he is and what he was actually doing changes how you read everything that followed. Dmitry Medvedev served as president of Russia from 2008 to 2012, during the period when Putin stepped back to the prime minister role, and then returned to the presidency. He has since served as deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council. He has no operational authority over Russia's nuclear arsenal. He cannot order a launch. He is not in the chain of command. What he is, and what analysts who track Russia closely have described explicitly, is a theatrical attack dog, a designated provocateur whose job is to say things on social media that the Kremlin wants floated publicly, but doesn't want attributed to Putin directly. He has referred to Europe as a cesspool. He has threatened nuclear strikes against multiple countries. He operates at a level of rhetorical aggression that most senior officials in any government would be fired for. And in late July 2025, after Trump announced a new, shortened deadline for Russia to agree to a Ukraine ceasefire, Medvedev posted a direct provocation. He compared Trump to, quote, Sleepy Joe. That was the personal insult. And then he referenced Russia's Soviet-era automatic nuclear strike capabilities. That was the signal. Trump did not ignore it. Trump engaged. On Truth Social, Trump told Medvedev to watch his words. That escalated it. Medvedev posted again saying Trump was playing the ultimatum game with Russia, and that each new ultimatum was a step toward war. Not between Russia and Ukraine, between Russia and America. Trump's response was the submarine announcement. Now here's the thing that the debate over whether Trump was escalating or deterring misses entirely. This entire exchange was happening inside a context that made it categorically more dangerous than any previous nuclear posturing between these two countries in decades. February 5th, 2026. 6 months after the submarine incident. The New START treaty expired. Not suspended. Not paused. Expired. The last legally binding nuclear arms control agreement between the United States and Russia, the treaty that capped both countries at 1,550 deployed strategic warheads and 700 deployed delivery systems, went away, permanently, without a successor in place. For context on how significant this is, you have to understand the timeline. The first Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty was signed in 1991. Before that, there was the SALT framework going back to 1972. Since Richard Nixon was in the White House, since the height of the Cold War, since the Cuban Missile Crisis was still a recent memory, the United States and Russia had maintained some form of legally binding, verifiable, mutually agreed limit on their nuclear weapons. 50 years of guardrails. 50 years of inspections, data exchanges, verification protocols, and mutual accountability. On February 5, 2026, those guardrails were gone. All of them. Simultaneously. What replaced them? A handshake. Literally. Trump's envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner negotiated on the sidelines of Ukraine talks in Abu Dhabi. The US and Russia agreed to informally observe the spirit of New START. One US official described it as a handshake deal because a formal extension is technically not permissible under the treaty's own terms. The treaty could only be extended once. That extension already happened in 2021. It couldn't happen again. So when it expired, there was nothing left to extend. Trump posted on social media on the day of expiration that rather than extend New START, the United States would seek, quote, a new, improved, and modernized treaty. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov told the Russian parliament that Russia, for now, would comply with a moratorium on respecting the central quantitative limitations. For now. A moratorium. Not a treaty. Not a verification regime. Not inspectors. A verbal commitment from the same government that was simultaneously using nuclear-capable cruise missiles in Ukraine and developing a nuclear anti-satellite weapon. The Atlantic Council's analysis was blunt. Russia's nuclear posturing during this entire period, the Medvedev threats, the references to automatic strike systems, the warnings after the submarine repositioning were not signs of strength. They were signs of frustration. Russia had been unable to intimidate Trump the way it had constrained Biden. The nuclear theater that had worked for 3 years under the previous administration, delaying weapons deliveries, shaping Western policy, creating self-imposed red lines, had stopped working. The Atlantic Council called it explicitly. Putin cannot intimidate his way to victory in Ukraine. The old playbook had been called and it failed. But here is where the story gets more complicated than either a pure deterrence success narrative or a pure reckless escalation narrative. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, in its May 2026 nuclear weapons assessment, confirmed something that had been suspected, but not officially documented at the level of specificity that report provided. Images of debris from Russian strikes in Ukraine in early 2026 confirmed that Moscow had used the nuclear-capable 9M729 ground-launched cruise missile. This is the exact same missile that the United States accused Russia of developing in violation of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, which Trump withdrew from in 2019, a nuclear-capable system, used in a conventional war, on the European continent, documented, confirmed. That is not rhetoric, that is hardware. And it was happening inside a period when Russia had also withdrawn its ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, when it had met with China's arms control officials in Beijing to discuss strategic stability in the absence of New START, and when both countries were in the process of modernizing delivery systems, the Burevestnik nuclear-powered cruise missile, the Poseidon underwater nuclear torpedo, the Oreshnik intermediate-range ballistic missile, all systems designed to evade or overwhelm American missile defenses, and none of which were covered by any existing arms control framework. The Columbia University Journal of International Affairs published a detailed analysis in April 2026 that framed what had happened during the submarine confrontation in structural terms. The Biden administration, it argued, had inadvertently validated Putin's nuclear strategy through caution. By consistently treating nuclear threats as credible constraints on Western support for Ukraine, the prior administration had demonstrated that nuclear signaling worked. The threat of escalation shaped real policy. Weapons were delayed. Red lines were self-imposed. Trump's approach was different. When Medvedev brandished nuclear capabilities on social media, Trump didn't pull back. He escalated. Nuclear submarines. Publicly announced. As a direct counter-signal. And it worked in the narrow tactical sense. The Kremlin distanced itself from Medvedev almost immediately. Peskov told reporters that Russia was not looking to get involved in the controversy and would not want to comment on it in any way. He called for caution on nuclear rhetoric, from the same government that had spent 3 years weaponizing nuclear rhetoric as a primary tool of strategic pressure. The same government whose officials were openly saying the old playbook had failed. The Columbia analysis concluded that Putin's nuclear theater had collapsed entirely. The failure of nuclear blackmail with Trump represented a potential inflection point. For the first time in the war's history, the West had called the bluff directly rather than adjusting behavior in response to it. That is the optimistic read. There is a less optimistic one. A group of bipartisan senators, led by Jeff Merkley, wrote directly to Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, warning that the absence of legally binding limits on U.S. and Russian strategic forces increases the risk of renewed nuclear competition and strategic instability. The former lead U.S. negotiator on New START, Rose Gottmoller, testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee that Russia could sprint ahead in a race to upload new warheads onto existing missiles if the United States doesn't take the Russian proposal for informal limits seriously and instead begins expanding its own deployed count. The Council on Foreign Relations put it plainly. There are no legally binding curbs on nuclear weapons between the two countries that hold 85% of the world's nuclear warheads. The only global mechanism that remains is the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and its next review conference is later this year. 4 things to understand about where this stands right now, in May 2026. First, the handshake deal is not verified. Both the US and Russia have said they are informally observing New START's central limits, but New START's verification regime, its inspection protocols, its data exchange requirements, the actual mechanism that made compliance checkable, those expired with the treaty. There is no way to independently confirm that either country is doing what it says it is doing. That is not an arms control framework. That is a promise between two nuclear powers who are simultaneously engaged in a proxy conflict over Ukraine and a growing strategic competition across multiple domains. Second, the submarine confrontation exposed something about Trump's approach to nuclear deterrence that breaks from every administration since Kennedy. Every previous administration treated nuclear signaling as something managed through back channels, classified communications, quiet diplomatic messages. Not a Truth Social post. The decision to announce submarine repositioning publicly, by name, with language about just in case, was a departure from 70 years of crisis communication protocol. Whether that departure made the situation more or less stable depends on whether you believe ambiguity or clarity is more effective as a deterrent. Security analysts continue to disagree sharply on that question. Third, the new weapons systems matter in a way that has not been adequately explained publicly. The Oreshnik ballistic missile that Russia used in Ukraine in 2024 travels at 10 times the speed of sound. It is not covered by any current arms control framework. The Burevestnik nuclear-powered cruise missile is theoretically unlimited in range. Also not covered. The Poseidon underwater torpedo is designed to create a radioactive tsunami. Also not covered. Every new Russian nuclear capability developed in the last 5 years exists in a legal vacuum, where there are no agreed limits, no agreed classifications, and no agreed verification requirements. And the informal handshake deal that replaced New START says nothing about any of them. Fourth, the China problem. Secretary of State Marco Rubio made the U.S. position explicit when he said that true arms control in the 21st century is impossible to do without including China because of their vast and rapidly growing stockpile. Russia has endorsed that position. China has declined to participate, which means any successor framework to New START requires the consent of 3 nuclear powers, 2 of whom are currently engaged in a strategic competition with the third that shows no sign of resolving. The submarine confrontation in August 2025 ended without incident. Medvedev backed off. The Kremlin urged calm. Trump claimed deterrence worked. The submarines presumably returned to normal patrol patterns. No shots were fired. No warheads were launched. The crisis, such as it was, de-escalated. But the structure underneath it, no treaty, no inspections, no verified limits, new weapons not covered by any framework, an informal handshake between countries with 10,000 nuclear weapons between them, that structure did not improve. It got more complicated, and the Atlantic Council analysis that called Putin's nuclear theater a sign of weakness also contained a warning. Putin seeks to demonstrate his readiness to prioritize the quest for victory in Ukraine above all other considerations, including the nuclear deterrence system established over decades by Russia and the United States. Over decades. Now that system is gone. The handshake is holding. For now. Subscribe. Because this story doesn't end with a social media exchange in August. It continues through every Ukraine ceasefire negotiation, every arms control hearing on Capitol Hill, and every day that passes without a legally binding successor to New START. I'll track it as it develops.